Hi, my name is Jess and welcome to my channel, Reads with a Ravenclaw. Today I'm going to be talking to you about all of the books I read this June. So I read 5 books this month, 2 of which are non-fiction, which is a genre that I hardly ever pick up. So I'm quite happy with the spread that I've read this month and I can't wait to get into discussing them with you. So the first 2 books I read, I don't have physical copies of with me because I got them out of my local library, but the first one is On Writing by Stephen King. So On Writing is a book about writing, it's a book that offers advice about writing, but it also is kind of like partially an autobiography almost, because he draws a lot on kind of anecdotes from his own life and his own experiences to discuss how he came to be a writer and how he came to understand writing. And I'm just going to be honest up front and say that I've never actually read a Stephen King book, mainly because, as I understand it, most of the books that he writes are either thrillers or horror, which are 2 genres that I'm not really a big fan of because they kind of stress me out. And really I chose this book to read this book because I know like how admired he is as a writer, and I've seen little quotes of his writing advice like flung about during NaNoWriMo videos and stuff, and I just thought like he seemed a very knowledgeable guy about writing. Even though I've never actually read one of his fiction books, I still really enjoyed On Writing because just the balance between his life stories and just like direct writing advice formed something that was really fun, really easy to read and very easy to get through. It was like a very conversational tone. He wasn't looking down on anybody when he was giving writing advice, and I really appreciated that and liked that. I also really liked the way that he broke down writing advice into talking about it as a sort of toolbox, and then you'll use like different compartments in the toolbox for different things, and I just thought it was a really clever analogy and one that kind of just my mind worked around quite well. And overall I just found it really enjoyable and really interesting to read, and I ended up giving it a 4.5 out of 5 stars. The next book I read this month is another one I don't have on me because I got it out of the library, and that is A Court of Wings and Ruin by Sarah J. Maas. So I have a full review of this already up on my channel in which I do kind of a non-spoilery section and then get on into the spoilers, so I will link that down below. And I'm not going to say too much about this book now because I go into like quite a bit of depth in that review. But generally the line that I go along in that review in terms of my feelings about this book is that as an end to Feyre's story, I found it very satisfying. I loved seeing the characters that we'd gotten to know in the first 2 books again, and I really admire Sarah J. Maas's work with group dynamics. I think she does a great job of having a lot of different voices and being able to juggle them and play them off against each other. But as a finale I wanted it to have more of an emotional impact than it did necessarily. I wanted it to kind of push harder. And this is a problem that I find I have in a lot of fantasy novels. I just feel like the first 2 books do such a great job of building up, and then the 3rd book just never quite goes hard enough to resolve it in the way that I want it to. And that's not saying that I didn't enjoy this. As I said, as like a close to Feyre's story, I think that it was a wonderful read, and I think that Sarah J. Maas just writes such addictive fantasy that I just completely plow through. But I ended up giving it a 3.75 out of 5 stars just because I didn't feel like it was as strong as A Court of Mist and Fury was. And I know that that rating seems kind of harsh and that some of you are probably going to hate me because of how well loved this book series is, but I kind of go into a bit more depth with my reasons for that rating in the review. So if you're interested, please have a look at it. The next book I read this month was Emma by Jane Austen, and this is like genuinely one of the most gorgeous books I own. I'd seen it on Peruse Project's channel, and then when I went into Waterstones and picked it up, I just thought it was too beautiful to not like want to have. So Emma is the story of a privileged young woman named Emma Woodhouse who fancies herself a bit of a matchmaker. And when she makes friends with a young woman called Harriet Smith, she decides to intervene in Harriet's love life and test her matchmaking skills, which has a lot of very entertaining consequences. This is the 3rd Jane Austen book that I've ever read. I've also read Pride and Prejudice and Persuasion, and I really enjoyed this one. I've actually tried to read it a couple of times before, but I've never really gotten into it, but this time it just really hooked me. I love that kind of subtle sarcasm that Jane Austen writes with a lot of the time. I really love just watching all of these massive misunderstandings unfold and all of their consequences. It's just like, you know what you're getting when you go into a Jane Austen book, but it still manages to just be like so addictive and fun to read, and I love that about these books. I also really love the fact that Emma is not a stereotypically likeable heroine. I think in Persuasion you naturally feel a lot of sympathy towards Anne, and in Pride and Prejudice everyone kind of recognises themselves in Lizzie Bennet a little bit, I think, but Emma definitely is the most flawed out of all three heroines in my opinion, and I really loved her for it, just because she felt very real, she felt very fallible, and it just really endeared her to me, even though that she did make some very questionable decisions. And overall I ended up giving this a 4 out of 5 stars, and I don't know where I would rate it on my scale of the 3 Jane Austen books that I've read. I do still think that Pride and Prejudice is my favourite, just because it's that quintessential love story that I've grown up with, and I think Emma and Persuasion are probably joint second. I think I'd have to reread Persuasion to make like a final decision on that account, but I definitely really enjoyed this one. The next book that I read this month is definitely my favourite book that I read this month, and one of my favourite books that I've read this year, and that is I Am Malala by Malala Yousafzai. So I'm sure that most of you recognise the name, recognise the face, but Malala was the young woman that was shot by the Taliban for her sticking up for, and for her father sticking up for the female rights to education. And this is just her talking about her life in Pakistan prior to the incident itself, and then the aftermath of everything that happened. And it's just like one of the most incredible real life stories that I've ever read. Lala has been one of my heroes since I first heard about the shooting, but honestly just reading this just made me appreciate her all the more. It's just incredible to have gone through what she has gone through and just to still retain like such a sense of humility. Like reading this, it was incredible to see all that she had gone through and all the awful things that she'd endured and all of the media attention, yet she still comes across as so down to earth and just completely dedicated to this cause of female education, and it's so admirable. She also does a really great job of just like evoking her situations both in Pakistan and Birmingham. Like, I really felt for her, and I really felt like I had a good grasp of what was going on in her mind during both times and in both places. I also really like how, though she is just a completely extraordinary woman and has stood up for a wonderful cause, she just seems like a normal teenage girl. Like she worries about she used to worry about the things that normal teenage girls worried about. She went through the same kind of coming of age processes. She just like was involved in this fight for female education and ended up getting caught up in it in a very life-threatening way. I can honestly not recommend this book highly enough. It really made me just kind of recognise and understand how privileged I am to have access to an education, and this month with me completing exams, it's been very easy for me to just kind of hate on school, but reading something like this does just make you kind of have to acknowledge how lucky you are. And I am just like, I admire Malala so much for really fighting for the cause that she believes in. And I ended up giving this a 5 out of 5 stars. The final book I read this month was actually a speech, which makes me realise that I actually read 3 non-fiction books this month instead of 2 like I said, and that is Very Good Lives by J.K. Rowling. Very Good Lives is the commencement speech that J.K. Rowling gave at Harvard a few years ago, and I think I showed this in a book haul, and I have read it before, but I don't think I've ever discussed it in a wrap-up. But it discusses, as it says along the bottom here, the fringe benefits of failure and the importance of imagination. I absolutely adore this speech, and I listen to it whenever I'm feeling like low or uncertain or a bit worried about things going wrong, because what J.K. Rowling really kind of hammers home in this speech is that everybody is going to fail at something in their lives, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing, it's just a necessary thing that has to happen, and we can find positive things in failure and positive outcomes from failure. And like I said, just coming out of exams, sometimes you kind of do need to be told that good things can come out of failure and that things are worth more, like there are things more worthy than exam grades, and that's something that is also touched on in this speech. It's a really great quote in this speech, well this speech is just full of great quotes, where J.K. Rowling talks about how rock bottom became the solid foundation on which she was able to rebuild her life. And she definitely doesn't glamorize failure, and she doesn't talk about it being fun, but she does say that you can just come out of it a lot stronger on the other side once your fears of failure are recognised and dealt with. And I think that for a university commencement speech, when you're about to go out into the adult world, that is probably a message that a lot of the people that were there that day needed to hear, and just a lot of people in the world in general need to hear. This edition of it is also really gorgeous. The print's like quite small, but there's a lot of just sort of like illustrations on the pages that are really beautiful. The speech is on YouTube if you want to give it a watch. I think it's about like 20 minutes, half an hour, and that is definitely a 20 minutes, half an hour that will be very well spent, and I also give this a 5 out of 5 stars. Okay, so those are all of the books I read this month. I hope you enjoyed listening to me ramble on about them. I definitely enjoyed rambling on about them. As always, thank you for watching, and until next time, goodbye.